The water closed over Clara Bennett's head before she even understood what had happened. One moment she was standing at the edge of the stone path near the lake, holding a glass of lemonade and listening to the soft music drifting from the garden party. The next moment, two hands had pressed hard against her back, and the world had tipped sideways into cold green water. She broke the surface, gasping, her dress heavy and clinging, her hair plastered across her face. For a few seconds, she could not hear anything except her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then the sound of laughter reached her. Not kind laughter. The sharp, delighted laughter of people who had just watched something humiliating happen to someone else. Standing at the edge of the lake, her silk gown untouched and perfect, was Isabel Grant. Her lips were curved into a small, satisfied smile, and her eyes were bright with a kind of triumph that made Clara's stomach turn colder than the water around her. "Oh dear," Isabel said, her voice carrying easily across the stunned garden. "I do hope you can swim." A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the crowd of guests. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others leaned closer to their companions, already whispering. Clara could see them all from where she treaded water, a blur of silk dresses and polished shoes, and wide, curious eyes, all gathered at the edge of the Ashford estate's famous lake, all watching her. This was supposed to be a simple afternoon. A garden party thrown by the Whitmore family to celebrate the engagement of Duke Alexander Whitmore and Isabel Grant. Clara had not wanted to come. She had told her Aunt Lydia 3 times that she had no interest in standing in a corner while people who barely acknowledged her existence sipped champagne and discussed matters of society she was no longer part of. But Aunt Lydia had insisted, reminding her that refusing an invitation from the Whitmore family would be seen as an insult, and the Bennets could not afford more insults, not after everything that had happened to their family's name in the past few years. So Clara had come. She had worn her best dress, a pale blue one that had been carefully mended at the hem more than once. She had smiled politely at people who did not remember her name, and she had tried, with everything in her, not to look at Alexander Whitmore. It had not worked. Their eyes had met only once, across the wide lawn, near the beginning of the party. He had been standing beside Isabel, nodding along to something an older gentleman was saying, when his gaze had drifted, almost without his permission, toward the edge of the crowd where Clara stood alone. For a moment, something flickered across his face, surprise, then something deeper, something he clearly tried to bury before anyone could notice it. Isabel had noticed it. Clara did not know exactly what had been said between the Duke and his fiancée after that moment. She had kept her distance, moving toward the refreshment table, trying to make herself as small and unremarkable as possible. But less than 20 minutes later, Isabel had appeared beside her near the lake, her voice sweet and cutting all at once. "You always did have a talent for showing up where you're not wanted," Isabel had said quietly, so only Clara could hear. Clara had not answered. She had learned, over the years, that silence was often the safest response to cruelty. But her silence, it seemed, had only made Isabel angrier. And now here she was, soaked to the skin, floating in the middle of the Ashford Lake, while half the county's finest families watched. For a moment, humiliation threatened to swallow her whole. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, despite the cold water, could imagine the stories that would spread through drawing rooms and dinner parties for weeks to come. Clara Bennett, pushed into a lake like a child during a game. Clara Bennett, made a fool of, in front of everyone who mattered. But then something shifted inside her. She thought of her father, who had always told her that dignity was not something anyone could take from you unless you allowed them to. She thought of the quiet, patient way her mother had endured years of whispered judgment after the family's fortune had been lost, never once losing her composure, never once giving the gossips the satisfaction of seeing her break. Clara had spent years watching her parents hold their heads high through circumstances far worse than a shove into a garden lake, and she was not about to become the one Bennett who crumbled in front of an audience. She stopped thrashing. Instead, she found her footing on the muddy lake bottom, straightened her back, and began to walk toward the shore with slow, deliberate steps, as though she were simply strolling out of a warm bath rather than climbing out of an embarrassing situation. Water streamed from her dress and her hair, but she did not rush. She did not cover her face. She lifted her chin and looked directly at the crowd that had gathered to watch her fall. The laughter faltered. It was a strange thing, the way a room, or in this case a garden, could shift its mood so quickly. A moment ago, the guests had been amused by her misfortune. Now, watching her rise from the water with such quiet, unshaken grace, something in their expressions began to change. A few of the women exchanged uncertain glances. An older gentleman near the front lowered his teacup slowly, as though he had just realized the joke was not as funny as he had thought. Isabel's smile faltered too, just slightly, just for a heartbeat, before she caught herself and forced it back into place. Clara reached the edge of the lake and stepped onto the grass. Someone, she never found out who, quickly draped a jacket over her shoulders. She murmured a thank you without looking to see whose it was, her eyes fixed steadily ahead, refusing to let a single tear fall no matter how much her chest ached with the unfairness of it all. It was in that moment, with water dripping from the hem of her ruined dress, and the entire garden watching in stunned silence, that Alexander Whitmore finally moved. He crossed the lawn in long, quick strides, ignoring the startled looks of his guests, ignoring the way his mother, the Duchess, called his name in a warning tone from somewhere near the tea tables. He stopped in front of Clara, his eyes moving over her soaked figure with an expression that was somewhere between concern and something far more complicated, something he had clearly been trying to suppress for a very long time. "Clara," he said, and his voice, though quiet, seemed to carry across the entire silent garden. "Are you hurt?" It was such a simple question, but the way he asked it, the raw worry in his tone, made something in Clara's chest tighten painfully. She had not heard him say her name like that in 5 years, not since the last time they had stood together in this very garden, young and foolish and certain that nothing could ever come between them. "I am fine, Your Grace," she said carefully, using his title deliberately, reminding both of them of the distance that now existed between their positions in the world. The water was simply colder than I expected. Behind him, Isabel's expression had gone rigid. "Alexander," she said sharply, "you're making a scene." He did not turn around immediately. For a long moment, he simply looked at Clara, and something passed between them that neither of them dared to name in front of so many watching eyes. Then, finally, he turned to face his fiancée. "A scene," he repeated slowly, "was already made, Isabel. I only arrived after it happened." The words were quiet, but they landed like a struck bell across the garden. A few guests exchanged glances again, this time with far more interest than sympathy. The Duchess, still standing near the tea tables, pressed her lips into a thin line and began walking toward her son with the brisk, purposeful steps of a woman who understood exactly how quickly a scandal could spread through a garden full of well-connected guests. Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes shifting between her, the Duke, and his fiancée, and she understood, with a sudden and unsettling clarity, that whatever had just happened by the edge of that lake was not going to be forgotten by tomorrow. It was not going to fade quietly into the background of one more awkward garden party story. Something had cracked open in front of everyone, and there would be no putting it back together the way it had been before. "I should go home," Clara said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. "Aunt Lydia will be worried." "Let me arrange a carriage for you," Alexander said immediately. "That won't be necessary," Isabel cut in, her voice tight with barely restrained anger. "I'm sure Miss Bennet is perfectly capable of finding her own way home, as she always has." There was a cruelty in those words that made several guests visibly wince, but Clara only offered a small, composed nod, refusing to give Isabel the reaction she was clearly hoping for. "Of course," Clara said. "Thank you for a memorable afternoon." She turned then, walking away from the lake, from the whispering crowd, from the man whose eyes she could feel following her every step of the way. She did not look back. She could not allow herself to look back, not when her heart was pounding so hard she feared everyone around her might hear it, not when 5 years of carefully built composure felt like it was threatening to unravel with every step she took away from him. But as she walked, soaked and shivering, and utterly humiliated in front of the very people who had once welcomed her into their world, Clara could not shake the strange, unfamiliar feeling growing quietly beneath her embarrassment. Something had changed today. She could feel it, the way one feels the first cold wind before a storm arrives. Isabel Grant had meant to humiliate her, to remind her of her place, to send a clear and public message that Clara Bennet did not belong anywhere near the Whitmore family. Instead, she had given Clara something else entirely. She had given every guest at that party a reason to question exactly what kind of woman Alexander Whitmore was about to marry, and exactly who the quiet, dignified Miss Bennet truly was. By the time Clara reached the edge of the estate's long driveway, her dress still dripping, and her hands still trembling from the cold, she realized that whatever happened next would not simply be about a ruined afternoon and a cruel joke. It would be about everything that came after. And unbeknownst to her, back at the garden, as guests slowly returned to their hushed conversations, and Isabel forced her smile back into place, a woman near the refreshment table leaned toward her companion and murmured 5 words that would begin to travel through society faster than either Isabel or Clara could have imagined. "Did you see his face?" News of what happened at the Ashford garden party spread faster than anyone at the estate could have predicted. By the following morning, Clara sat at the small breakfast table in her aunt's modest townhouse, staring at a cup of tea that had long gone cold, while Aunt Lydia paced the room with a folded newspaper clutched tightly in her hand. "It's in the society pages," Lydia said, her voice tight with a mixture of worry and disbelief. "Not by name, of course. They never use names directly. But everyone will know exactly who they mean. Listen to this. A certain young lady, once familiar to the finest circles, found herself unexpectedly submerged during festivities at the Whitmore estate, prompting the Duke himself to abandon all social decorum in her defense." Clara closed her eyes briefly. "They make it sound like a scandal." "It is a scandal, dear girl," Lydia said, setting the newspaper down with a heavy sigh, "whether you wanted it to be or not." Clara wrapped both hands around her cold teacup, trying to steady the slight tremor that had not quite left her fingers since the day before. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same image, Isabel's satisfied smile, the cold shock of the water, and then Alexander's face, filled with a concern he had not bothered to hide from anyone. "He shouldn't have said anything," Clara murmured. "He only made it worse." "He made it worse for himself," Lydia corrected gently, sitting down across from her niece. "For you, I suspect it may prove to be something else entirely." Clara looked up. "What do you mean?" Lydia hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I mean that half of society witnessed a duke defend a woman who is not his fiancée, in front of his own mother, in front of his intended bride, in front of everyone whose opinion matters in this city. People do not forget a moment like that, Clara. They will talk about it for weeks, and eventually, they will start asking questions about why he reacted the way he did." "There is nothing to question," Clara said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "It was 5 years ago. It means nothing now." But even as she said the words, she knew they were not entirely true, and from the soft, knowing look on her aunt's face, it was clear Lydia knew it too. 5 years ago, Clara Bennet and Alexander Whitmore had been something to each other that neither of them had ever spoken of publicly. Back then, Alexander had not yet inherited his title. His older brother had still been alive, still been the one expected to carry the Whitmore name forward, and Alexander had been free to spend his summers wandering the countryside, without the weight of a dukedom pressing down on every decision he made. It was during one of those summers, at a small gathering hosted by mutual family friends, that he had first spoken to Clara Bennet, then a bright, curious young woman, with a sharp wit, and no interest whatsoever in impressing a future lord. He had been drawn to her immediately, precisely because she treated him like an ordinary young man, rather than a title waiting to happen. They had spent that entire summer finding excuses to be near each other. Long walks through orchards, quiet conversations on garden benches after everyone else had gone inside. Letters exchanged in secret when their families were not looking. By the end of that summer, Alexander had promised her, quietly and earnestly, that whatever obstacles stood between them, he intended to find a way past every single one. Then his brother had died unexpectedly of a sudden illness, and everything had changed. Alexander became the heir to the Whitmore dukedom almost overnight, and with that transformation came an entirely new set of expectations. His father, the old duke, made it clear within weeks that Alexander's future wife would need to bring more to the marriage than affection. She would need to bring connections, wealth, and social standing, capable of securing the family's position for generations to come. The Bennet family, once respectable and comfortable, had suffered its own quiet collapse around that same time, following a series of poor investments made by Clara's father that had drained much of their fortune. By the time Alexander's father learned of the connection between his son and Clara Bennet, the match had already become, in his eyes, entirely unsuitable. Clara remembered the day the letters stopped coming with painful clarity. She had waited for weeks, checking every post, convincing herself there was some reasonable explanation. It was only much later, through a mutual friend, that she learned Alexander had been sent abroad for an extended period, and that his engagement to Isabel Grant, daughter of a wealthy and well-connected family, had been arranged not long after his return. She had told herself, over and over across 5 long years, that it no longer mattered, that whatever had existed between them had been nothing more than a young, foolish summer romance, the kind that everyone experienced once and eventually outgrew. She had built a quiet, careful life for herself since then, helping her aunt manage the household, taking on occasional work as a companion to older women in society who needed someone reliable and well-mannered by their side. She had almost convinced herself the feelings were gone entirely. Then she had seen him again yesterday, standing beside his fiancée at that garden party, and every carefully built wall she had constructed around her heart had cracked in an instant. "You should stay away from any further Whitmore events," Lydia said, breaking through Clara's thoughts. "For your own sake, and for the sake of what little reputation this family has left." "I have no intention of attending anything else," Clara said firmly. "I only went yesterday because you insisted." "Yes, well," Lydia said, folding the newspaper again with a slightly guilty expression. "I did not anticipate quite this outcome." A sharp knock at the front door interrupted them both. Lydia rose to answer it, and Clara heard the low murmur of voices in the hallway before her aunt returned, holding a small, elegant envelope sealed with a wax stamp that Clara recognized immediately. The Whitmore family crest. "It's addressed to you," Lydia said quietly, handing it over. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Inside was a short, carefully worded note, in handwriting she remembered far too well. "I must speak with you. Please allow me the chance to explain, if only once. I will be at the old orchard path tomorrow morning at 9, where we used to walk. If you do not come, I will understand, and I will not trouble you again." There was no signature, but none was needed. Clara stared at the note for a long moment, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. Every rational part of her mind insisted that meeting him privately, especially now, especially after everything that had happened at the garden party, would only invite more scandal, more danger to her already fragile reputation. But another part of her, the part she had spent 5 years trying to silence, whispered that she deserved answers after all this time, that she deserved to finally understand why he had let her go so easily, why he had never once tried to explain himself before disappearing into a life that no longer included her. "What does it say?" Lydia asked gently. Clara folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket. "Nothing important," she lied. But that night, long after her aunt had gone to bed, Clara sat by her window, staring out at the darkened street, turning the decision over and over in her mind. She thought of Isabel's cruel smile by the lake, of the whispered gossip already spreading through the city, of everything she stood to lose if she was seen meeting privately with an engaged duke. And yet, when morning came, she found herself dressing carefully, choosing a plain gray traveling coat that would draw no unwanted attention, and slipping quietly out of the house before her aunt had even woken. The old orchard path lay just beyond the edge of the city, a quiet, half-forgotten stretch of land that had once belonged to a family friend who had long since passed away. Clara had not walked that path in 5 years, not since the last afternoon she and Alexander had spent there together, promising each other a future that had never come to pass. She arrived just before 9, her heart hammering with a nervous energy she had not felt in years. The orchard trees stood tall and quiet around her, their branches heavy with the first hints of summer growth, and for a brief, strange moment, it felt as though no time had passed at all. Then she saw him. Alexander stood near the old wooden bench beneath the largest tree, dressed simply, without any of the formal trappings of his title, looking so much like the young man she had once known that her breath caught painfully in her chest. He turned as she approached, and the relief that crossed his face was unmistakable. "You came," he said quietly. "I almost didn't," Clara admitted, stopping a careful distance away from him. "I still don't fully understand why I did." "Because you deserve an explanation," Alexander said, "even after all this time, especially after all this time." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, though the morning was not particularly cold. "Then explain. Why did the letters stop, Alexander? Why did you simply disappear without a single word? He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tightening as though he were fighting against some old, painful memory. Because my father made certain that every letter I wrote to you never left this estate, he said finally, and every letter you sent me, he intercepted and destroyed before I ever saw them. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. What? I did not abandon you, Clara, Alexander said, his voice rough with an emotion he had clearly been holding back for a very long time. I was told you had stopped writing. I was told you had moved on, found someone more suitable for your situation. I believed it, because why would I not? I had no reason to think my own father capable of such deception. Not until years later, when a former servant of this estate finally told me the truth, long after it was too late to change anything. The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. 5 years of believing she had been abandoned, 5 years of quietly nursing a wound she had assumed was entirely one-sided, and now, standing beneath the same orchard trees where they had once made impossible promises to each other, she was learning that none of it had been true at all. Why are you telling me this now? She whispered. Alexander took a step closer, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her chest ache. Because yesterday, when I saw you standing at the edge of that lake, soaked and humiliated in front of everyone who mattered, and I realized how easily I could have lost you entirely, without ever knowing the truth, I understood that I could not continue pretending any longer. Not to myself, not to Isabel, and not to you. The weight of his words settled over the quiet orchard like a held breath. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, and the morning light shifted softly through the branches above them, but Clara barely noticed any of it. All she could see was the man standing in front of her, finally telling her the truth she had waited 5 long years to hear, and all she could feel was the terrifying, undeniable realization that nothing between them had ever truly ended at all.
Alexander, she said softly, you are engaged to be married.
I know, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of everything that truth implied, and that is precisely the problem I intend to solve. Clara did not sleep at all that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, replaying every word Alexander had spoken beneath the orchard trees. The betrayal by his father, the stolen letters, the years of silence that had never truly been silence at all, only a carefully constructed lie designed to keep two people apart for the sake of wealth and standing. By the time morning arrived, Clara had made a decision. She would not chase after a man who was still, despite everything, engaged to marry someone else. Whatever feelings had resurfaced between them beneath those orchard trees, she refused to become the woman blamed for the collapse of the Whitmore engagement. She had already survived one public humiliation this week. She had no intention of inviting another. She dressed quietly, determined to spend the day focused on practical matters, mending the hem of her blue dress, helping her aunt with household accounts, anything that might keep her mind away from orchard paths and stolen letters, and the aching, unresolved feeling still sitting heavy in her chest. Her plans lasted only until mid-morning, when a visitor arrived that neither Clara nor her aunt had expected. Mr. Charles Bellamy to see you, the housemaid announced, ushering in a tall, thin man dressed in the sober, well-tailored clothing of a professional gentleman. He carried a leather case under one arm and wore the careful, measured expression of a man accustomed to delivering complicated news. Bellamy, Aunt Lydia repeated, rising from her chair with visible surprise. The family solicitor. Whatever brings you to our door. Forgive the intrusion, Bellamy said, offering a polite bow. I represent the interests of several families in this city, including, until recently, matters connected to the Grant estate. I have come because certain information has recently come into my possession, information I believe Miss Bennet has a right to know, given the events of this past week. Clara exchanged a wary glance with her aunt before gesturing for the solicitor to sit. Please, Mr. Bellamy, what sort of information could possibly involve me? Bellamy opened his leather case and withdrew a small stack of papers, arranging them carefully on the table between them. I must first ask for your discretion regarding what I am about to share. The circumstances are delicate, and premature disclosure could cause significant harm to several parties, including yourself. You have my word, Clara said, though her curiosity had already sharpened into something closer to alarm. Very well, Bellamy said. I have spent the better part of the last 2 years managing certain financial matters for the Grant family, at the request of Mr. Henry Grant, Isabel Grant's father. During that time, I became aware of significant debts accumulated by the family, debts far exceeding what has been publicly acknowledged. Lydia's eyebrows rose sharply. Debts? The Grants are considered one of the wealthiest families in the county. They were, Bellamy corrected carefully. Several unfortunate investments over the past 3 years have left the family in a considerably weaker position than society believes. It is my understanding that the engagement between Miss Grant and the Duke of Ashford was arranged, at least in part, to secure the Grant family's financial future through connection to the Whitmore fortune. Clara sat back slowly, absorbing this information. You are telling me that Isabel's engagement to Alexander is not simply a matter of affection. I am telling you, Bellamy said, that it is very likely a matter of necessity. And there is more. He withdrew another document from his case, this one older, its edges slightly worn. During my review of the Grant family's private correspondence, conducted at their own request regarding an unrelated financial matter, I discovered several letters that I believe were never meant to leave this estate. Letters addressed to you, Miss Bennet, from the Duke, dated approximately 5 years ago. Clara's heart stopped. What? It appears, Bellamy continued carefully, that Isabel Grant's mother, Mrs. Grant, maintained a close friendship with the late Duke, Alexander's father, during the period in question. I believe she assisted him in intercepting correspondence between yourself and the young Lord Whitmore, at his request, in exchange for certain financial considerations that benefited the Grant family during a difficult period. You mean to say, Aunt Lydia said slowly, her voice tight with disbelief, that the Grant family was paid to help separate Clara and the Duke, specifically so that Isabel might one day take her place? I cannot say with certainty what the full intentions were at the time, Bellamy said. But the timeline of events, and the documents I have recovered, strongly suggest that possibility. I discovered these papers only recently, while conducting an unrelated audit of the Grant family accounts. Given the events at the garden party, and the public interest they have generated, I felt it was my duty to bring this information to your attention, before it was buried entirely. Clara stared at the worn letters Bellamy had placed on the table, her own handwriting visible on the outside of one. A letter she remembered writing 5 years ago, full of hope and youthful certainty. A letter that had apparently never reached the man it was intended for. Why are you telling me this now, Mr. Bellamy? Clara asked quietly. You risk a great deal by sharing information that could damage the Grant family's reputation so severely. Bellamy was quiet for a moment, his expression carefully composed. I have served this city's finest families for over 20 years, Miss Bennet. I have watched a great many injustices occur behind closed doors. Injustices I was often powerless to correct due to the confidential nature of my work. But there comes a point when silence becomes its own kind of wrongdoing. What happened to you 5 years ago was not simply an unfortunate misunderstanding. It was a deliberate deception, engineered by people who benefited from your suffering. I do not believe that should remain buried simply because revealing it might prove inconvenient for those responsible. Clara reached out slowly and picked up the letter bearing her own handwriting, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded it. The words inside were exactly as she remembered writing them, full of longing and quiet devotion, addressed to a man who had never been allowed to read them. Does Alexander know about any of this? She asked. Not to my knowledge, Bellamy said. I felt it was important that you learn the truth first, given how directly it concerns you. What you choose to do with this information is, of course, entirely your decision. After Bellamy departed, promising to remain available should Clara wish to discuss the matter further, Clara sat in silence for a long time, staring at the small collection of letters spread across the table before her. Aunt Lydia watched her carefully, saying nothing, allowing her niece the space to absorb the enormity of what had just been revealed. This changes everything, Clara finally said. It certainly complicates things, Lydia agreed carefully. The question is what you intend to do about it. Clara thought of Isabel, standing at the edge of the lake, smiling with such cold satisfaction, as Clara struggled in the water below her. She thought of the whispered gossip already spreading through society following the garden party. And now, sitting in front of her, was proof that the entire foundation of Isabel's engagement to Alexander had been built upon a deliberate act of cruelty against Clara herself, years before that engagement had ever been announced. Part of her wanted to march straight to the Whitmore estate and expose everything immediately, to watch Isabel's carefully maintained composure crumble, the same way Clara's dignity had been tested at that garden party. But another part of her, the more careful, more measured part that had learned patience through years of quiet hardship, recognized that revealing such damaging information carelessly could cause harm far beyond what she intended, and could easily be dismissed as nothing more than a desperate attempt to disrupt an engagement out of jealousy. "I need to think carefully before I act," Clara said slowly. "If I go to Alexander now, with nothing but old letters and a solicitor's suspicions, Isabel's family will simply deny everything, and I will be the one who appears vindictive and unstable." "A wise assessment," Lydia said approvingly. "What do you propose instead?" Clara considered the question for a long moment, her mind working through the possibilities with a clarity she had not expected to find amid such emotional turmoil. "I propose we gather more than suspicion, Aunt Lydia. If Mrs. Grant truly assisted the late Duke in this deception, there must be more evidence somewhere. Financial records, perhaps other correspondence. Mr. Bellamy has already shown a willingness to help. I intend to ask him precisely how far that willingness extends." Over the following days, Clara met with Bellamy twice more, each time uncovering small additional pieces of the puzzle. A record of payment made to the Grant family shortly after Alexander's departure abroad. A brief mention in an old diary belonging to a former Whitmore housekeeper, describing how young Lord Whitmore's letters were regularly collected and destroyed at the old Duke's explicit instruction. None of it was, by itself, conclusive proof capable of standing up to public scrutiny. But together, piece by piece, a clear and troubling picture began to emerge. Meanwhile, word continued to spread through society regarding the incident at the garden party. Clara heard, through her aunt's careful network of acquaintances, that Isabel had grown increasingly irritable and demanding in the days since, snapping at servants and canceling social engagements without explanation. She heard too that Alexander had been noticeably absent from several events he would normally have attended alongside his fiancée, fueling further speculation about the true state of their engagement. It was nearly a week after her conversation with Alexander in the orchard, when Clara received another message from him, this one delivered not by formal letter, but by a trusted servant who had once worked for both families and could be relied upon for discretion. The message was brief. "My father's old study has not been touched since his death. There may be answers there neither of us have yet found. Meet me tonight, after the household has retired. I will leave the side entrance unlocked." Clara stared at the note for a long time, weighing the risk of what he was proposing. Entering the Whitmore estate secretly, at night, to search through a dead man's private study, was far more dangerous to her reputation than a quiet morning walk through an old orchard path. If she were discovered, there would be no explanation capable of protecting her from the resulting scandal. But if there was even a chance of finding proof strong enough to expose the truth once and for all, proof that could finally clear away 5 years of manufactured lies, Clara knew she could not simply walk away from the opportunity. That night, dressed in a plain dark coat and moving as quietly as she possibly could through the shadowed streets, Clara made her way toward the Whitmore estate, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination she had rarely felt so intensely in her entire life. The side entrance, as promised, stood slightly ajar, and beyond it, a single candle flickered in the darkness, held by a figure she recognized instantly despite the dim light. "You came," Alexander whispered, echoing the same words he had spoken to her days earlier beneath the orchard trees. "I seem to have developed a habit of doing so," Clara whispered back, stepping carefully through the doorway into the quiet, sleeping house. Together, they moved silently through darkened hallways toward the late Duke's private study, neither of them fully aware yet of exactly what they were about to discover, or how completely it would change the course of everything that followed. The late Duke's study smelled of old paper and dust that had not been disturbed in years. Alexander closed the heavy door behind them carefully, setting his single candle down on the wide desk that dominated the center of the room. Shelves of leather-bound books lined the walls, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched down from ornate frames, giving the entire space an atmosphere of quiet, watchful judgment. "No one has touched this room since he passed," Alexander said quietly, glancing around at the shadowed shelves. "My mother could never bring herself to clear it out, and I confess, I avoided it for reasons of my own." "What are we looking for exactly?" Clara whispered, moving toward the nearest set of drawers. I am not entirely certain, Alexander admitted. But if my father kept records of the payments made to the Grant family, or correspondence proving what he did to keep us apart, this room is the most likely place to find them. He trusted no one else with matters he considered private. They worked carefully and quietly, searching through drawers filled with old business correspondence, tax records, and property documents spanning decades of Whitmore family history. Clara's fingers moved through stacks of yellowed papers, her heart pounding every time footsteps seemed to echo somewhere in the house beyond the study door, though each time it proved to be nothing more than the old building settling in the night. It was nearly an hour into their search when Alexander, kneeling beside a locked cabinet at the base of one bookshelf, finally managed to pry it open using a small iron key he had found hidden inside his father's old writing desk. Clara, he said, his voice suddenly tight with tension. Come look at this. Inside the cabinet lay a small collection of bound ledgers and a thick stack of letters tied together with faded ribbon. Alexander carefully lifted the stack of letters and untied the ribbon, revealing dozens of envelopes, many addressed in handwriting Clara recognized immediately as her own. These are the letters I sent you, she breathed, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the stack. All of them. He kept every single one. Alexander opened one of the ledgers, flipping through pages of careful, precise handwriting, documenting various financial transactions. His expression grew darker with each page he examined. Here, he said finally, pointing to an entry dated shortly after Clara's letters had stopped arriving. A payment made to Mrs. Eleanor Grant, described only as compensation for discreet assistance regarding a family matter. Isabel's mother, Clara said quietly. There are several more entries, Alexander continued, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. Payments made over the course of nearly a year, each one following almost immediately after a letter from you was intercepted. It seems my father did not act alone in this. He required someone with regular access to the postal routes between our two families, and Mrs. Grant, given her friendship with our household staff at the time, was well positioned to provide exactly that. Clara sat down heavily in the chair beside the desk, the weight of the discovery settling over her like a physical burden. 5 years of believing she had simply been forgotten, replaced, deemed unworthy of a young lord's continued affection. 5 years of quiet grief she had carried largely alone, never suspecting that the entire situation had been deliberately engineered by two families, working together for their own benefit. Why would your father go to such lengths? She asked quietly. Surely there were simpler ways to discourage the match, if he objected so strongly. My father valued control above almost everything else, Alexander said, his voice heavy with old resentment. He would not have trusted a simple conversation to end things cleanly. He wanted certainty. He wanted me to believe, without any doubt, that you had chosen to walk away on your own, so that I would never think to question the outcome or seek you out again. And Mrs. Grant agreed to help, in exchange for money, Clara said slowly, piecing the rest together herself. Because by then, the Grant family's fortune had already begun to suffer. It would explain a great deal, Alexander said grimly. If she saw an opportunity to secure her own daughter's future by helping to clear the path toward an eventual engagement with the future Duke of Ashford, while simultaneously receiving payment for the assistance, she would have had every incentive to agree. Clara pressed her hands against her face for a moment, trying to steady the storm of emotions rising inside her. Anger at the deception, grief for the years lost, and underneath it all, a strange, unsettling relief at finally understanding the truth after so long believing something entirely different. This proves everything, she said finally, lowering her hands and looking up at Alexander with renewed determination. The payments, the timing, it is all documented here, in your father's own handwriting. This is proof, Alexander. Real proof, not simply suspicion or old rumors. Yes, Alexander agreed slowly, though his expression remained troubled. But proof of what, exactly, and to what end? If I reveal this publicly, it does not simply expose my father's deception. It exposes Isabel's mother as complicit in a scheme to secure her daughter's engagement through manipulation and financial gain. It will destroy the Grant family's reputation entirely, and very likely end my engagement to Isabel in the most public and damaging way possible. Is that not exactly what should happen? Clara asked, though even as she said it, She recognized the complicated tangle of consequences such a revelation would create. It is what should happen, Alexander agreed. But I want to be certain that whatever comes next happens for the right reasons, and not simply because I am angry at discovering the truth. I do not wish for you to become collateral damage in whatever scandal follows, Clara. You have already suffered enough because of decisions made entirely without your knowledge or consent. Clara considered his words carefully. Despite everything, despite the anger simmering beneath her composed exterior, she recognized the wisdom in his caution. A hasty, emotional confrontation could easily backfire, painting her as a bitter woman seeking revenge rather than someone who had been genuinely wronged. Then we proceed carefully, she said finally. We gather everything we can from this study tonight, and we decide together exactly how and when to reveal what we have found. Not out of anger, Alexander, but in a way that ensures the truth cannot be dismissed or twisted against us. Alexander nodded slowly, a faint, grateful smile crossing his face, despite the gravity of their discovery. You always did have a clearer head than I did, even when we were young. They spent another hour carefully documenting everything they found, copying relevant entries from the ledgers, gathering the intercepted letters into a secure bundle that Alexander promised to keep locked away until they were ready to act. As the night grew later, Clara felt exhaustion beginning to weigh heavily on her, both physical and emotional, the accumulated strain of the past week finally catching up with her. You should return home before dawn, Alexander said gently, noticing the tired lines around her eyes. I do not wish for your reputation to suffer any further because of tonight's necessary work. And what will you do? Clara asked, gathering her coat around her shoulders as they prepared to leave the study. Alexander was quiet for a moment, his expression turning serious. I intend to speak with Isabel directly, before anything else happens. She deserves to hear the truth from me, regardless of her mother's involvement, before it becomes public knowledge through other means. And I intend to end our engagement, Clara, regardless of what consequences follow. I have known for some time now that continuing forward with this marriage would be a mistake, long before tonight's discovery confirmed exactly why it was arranged in the first place. Clara's heart clenched at his words, a complicated mixture of hope and fear rising within her. Alexander, ending your engagement publicly, especially now, will only invite more scandal. People will assume the worst about both of us. Let them assume what they wish, Alexander said firmly. I have spent 5 years living according to expectations, built upon a lie I did not even know existed. I will not spend the rest of my life bound to a marriage constructed on the same foundation, simply to avoid uncomfortable gossip. They left the study together, carefully retracing their steps through the darkened house until they reached the same side entrance through which Clara had entered hours earlier. Standing in the cool night air outside, neither of them quite ready to part ways, Alexander reached out and gently took her hand. Whatever happens next, he said quietly, I do not intend to lose you again, Clara. Not to my father's lies, not to Isabel's engagement, not to anything else that might try to stand between us. Clara looked up at him, feeling the weight of 5 years of separation, 5 years of grief and quiet longing, finally beginning to lift from her chest. Then let us finish what we started tonight, she said softly, together, and carefully, so that nothing can be used against us when the truth finally comes out. He nodded, gently releasing her hand, as she turned to make her way back through the quiet, sleeping streets toward her aunt's house. But as Clara walked away into the darkness, neither of them noticed the faint movement of a curtain in an upstairs window of the Whitmore estate, nor the pair of narrowed eyes that had been watching their entire exchange from the shadows above. Isabel Grant had not been sleeping, and she had seen far more than either of them realized. Isabel Grant stood at her window long after Clara Bennett had disappeared into the darkened streets, her fingers gripping the curtains so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. She had not been able to sleep since the garden party. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the moment Alexander had crossed the lawn toward Clara, ignoring her, ignoring his own mother, ignoring every guest watching the scene unfold. It had haunted her for days, a small crack in the foundation of everything she had worked so carefully to build. And now this. Alexander sneaking through his own family's estate in the dead of night, meeting secretly with Clara Bennett in his father's private study. Isabel did not know exactly what they had been searching for, but she knew, with the sharp instinct of a woman who had spent her entire life reading the subtle currents of society, that whatever they had found was dangerous. She let the curtain fall closed and turned toward the small writing desk in the corner of her bedroom, sitting down with trembling hands to compose a letter to her mother. If Alexander was digging through his father's old records, there was a very real possibility he had uncovered something related to the arrangement her mother had made all those years ago, an arrangement Isabel herself had only learned about 2 years earlier, during a heated argument between her parents about the family's declining finances. She remembered the conversation with painful clarity. Her mother, exhausted and desperate after another failed investment had drained more of the family's dwindling fortune, had snapped at her father that at least she had secured Isabel's future properly, unlike his reckless business decisions. When Isabel had pressed her mother for an explanation, Mrs. Grant had reluctantly revealed the truth. The old Duke had approached her years earlier, offering generous payment in exchange for assistance intercepting correspondence between his son and a young woman he considered entirely unsuitable for the family's future. Isabel had been horrified at first, understanding immediately the moral weight of what her mother had done. But over time, as her own engagement to Alexander solidified and her family's financial situation grew increasingly precarious, she had allowed herself to set aside the discomfort, telling herself that the past could not be changed, and that her marriage to Alexander represented the family's only realistic path back toward financial security. Now, staring at the blank paper in front of her, Isabel understood with growing dread that the past she had tried so hard to leave buried was about to resurface in the worst possible way. She wrote quickly, urging her mother to visit as soon as possible, explaining only that a serious matter required immediate discussion. She sealed the letter and arranged for it to be delivered first thing in the morning, then sat awake for the remainder of the night, turning over every possible way the situation might unfold. Mrs. Grant arrived at the Whitmore estate shortly after breakfast, her expression tightening with alarm as Isabel explained, in a hushed and urgent voice, everything she had witnessed the previous night. He was in his father's study, Isabel said, pacing the length of her private sitting room, while her mother listened with a carefully controlled expression. With Clara Bennett, searching through old papers, mother. What if he found the ledgers? What if he found the letters? There is no possible way he could know precisely what to look for, Mrs. Grant said, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested. The old Duke was always meticulous about keeping such matters private. Meticulous enough to keep detailed records of every payment he made you, Isabel said sharply. You told me yourself, mother, that he insisted on documenting everything. What if those records still exist somewhere in that house? Mrs. Grant sank slowly into a nearby chair, her composure finally beginning to crack. If that boy has found proof of what happened, Isabel, we must consider very carefully how to respond before he decides to act on it. What would you have us do? Isabel demanded. Deny everything? Alexander is not a fool, and neither, apparently, is Clara Bennett. If they have found real evidence, denial will only make us appear guiltier. Then perhaps, Mrs. Grant said slowly, her mind clearly working through the problem with the same calculating precision that had allowed her to arrange the original deception years earlier. We must ensure that whatever evidence they believe they have found is discredited before it can be used against us. How do you propose we do that? Mrs. Grant's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. The old ledgers, if they exist, would be considered private financial records belonging to the Whitmore estate. Alexander cannot simply present them publicly without raising uncomfortable questions about his own father's character, questions that would reflect poorly on the entire Whitmore name, not simply on our family. He has every reason to want this matter handled quietly, just as we do. You believe he will choose to protect his father's reputation over exposing the truth. I believe, Mrs. Grant said carefully, that we should approach him directly, before Clara Bennett has the chance to convince him otherwise. Remind him of everything he stands to lose by making this matter public. His mother's reputation, his father's legacy, his own standing among his peers, many of whom would begin to question his judgment for associating so closely with a woman of such diminished social standing, regardless of whatever misguided affection he still holds for her. Isabel considered her mother's words carefully, though a small, uncomfortable knot of doubt had begun forming in her stomach. She thought of Alexander's face at the garden party, the raw concern he had shown for Clara without a single thought for how it might appear to his guests. She thought of the quiet, unshakable dignity Clara had displayed while rising from that lake, an image that had haunted Isabel far more than she wanted to admit, even to herself. "And if he refuses to be swayed by such concerns?" Isabel asked quietly. "What if he has already decided that the truth matters more to him than protecting appearances?" Mrs. Grant's expression hardened. "Then we will need to consider other measures to protect this family's future, Isabel. I did not spend years building the foundation for your engagement to a duke simply to watch it collapse now, over old letters and misplaced sentiment." Later that same afternoon, Alexander received an unexpected visit from Mrs. Grant at the Whitmore estate, arriving without prior notice and requesting a private conversation regarding what she described only as a delicate family matter. They spoke in the formal drawing room, Alexander maintaining a carefully neutral expression throughout the conversation, as Mrs. Grant attempted, with practiced grace, to steer the discussion toward the importance of family loyalty, the value of protecting one's parents' legacy even after their passing, and the potential damage that could be done to multiple families through the careless exposure of old, painful history best left undisturbed. "I understand your concern for both our families' reputations," Alexander said finally, once Mrs. Grant had finished her carefully constructed appeal. "But I must ask you directly, Mrs. Grant, since you have chosen to raise this matter so openly. Did you assist my late father in intercepting correspondence between myself and Clara Bennett 5 years ago, in exchange for financial compensation?" The directness of the question clearly caught Mrs. Grant off guard, though she recovered quickly, her expression settling into practiced composure. "Your Grace, I believe you are placing far too much weight on old rumors and misunderstandings. Whatever assistance I may have provided your father during a difficult period in both our families' histories was intended only to protect the future stability of the Whitmore line, nothing more." "That is not a denial," Alexander observed quietly. Mrs. Grant's composure faltered slightly. "Your father believed, quite reasonably, that a match between yourself and Miss Bennett would have proven disastrous given the collapse of her family's fortune at the time. I simply assisted him in ensuring that outcome was avoided, for the benefit of everyone involved, including, ultimately, Miss Bennett herself, who has since built a perfectly respectable, if modest, life for herself. A life built upon believing she had been abandoned by someone she trusted," Alexander said, his voice growing sharper with barely controlled anger. "A belief manufactured entirely by yourself and my father, for reasons that had nothing to do with her welfare, and everything to do with securing my engagement to your daughter. Your Grace," Mrs. Grant said carefully, "I would urge you to consider very carefully what you intend to do with whatever information you believe you possess. Revealing such matters publicly would damage not only my family's reputation, but your own father's legacy, and by extension, your mother's standing within society. Is that truly a price you are prepared to pay, for the sake of a romance that ended 5 years ago?" Alexander rose slowly from his seat, his expression cold and unwavering. "It did not end, Mrs. Grant. It was stolen. And I intend to see that theft acknowledged and corrected, regardless of the cost to anyone's reputation, including my own." Mrs. Grant left the estate shortly afterward, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking as she climbed into her waiting carriage. She understood, with growing dread, that her attempt to protect her family through quiet persuasion had failed entirely, and that whatever came next would require far more drastic measures than she had initially anticipated. That evening, as Alexander sat alone in his study reflecting on the confrontation, a servant delivered an unexpected message, informing him that Isabel wished to speak with him privately, immediately, regarding a matter she described as urgent and deeply personal. He found her waiting in the same drawing room where her mother had sat only hours earlier, her usual composed elegance replaced by something far more vulnerable, something Alexander had rarely glimpsed beneath her carefully maintained public persona. "My mother told me about your conversation," Isabel said quietly, not bothering with any of her usual pleasantries. "I know what you have discovered, Alexander, and I need you to understand something before you decide what to do next." "What is that?" Alexander asked carefully. Isabel met his eyes directly, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of what she was about to say. "I did not know the full truth when our engagement was first arranged. I want you to believe that, even if you believe nothing else I say to you. But I have known for the past 2 years, Alexander, and I chose to remain silent, because our marriage represented the only realistic solution to my family's financial troubles. I am not proud of that choice. but I need you to understand exactly what you are dealing with before you decide how to proceed." The confession, delivered with unexpected honesty, left Alexander momentarily speechless. Whatever he had expected from this conversation, it had not been this quiet, unguarded admission of guilt. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked finally. Isabel's composure wavered slightly before she answered. "Because I watched you at that garden party, Alexander. I watched the way you looked at her, the way you crossed that entire lawn without a single thought for what anyone would think. And I realized, watching that moment, that I have never once seen you look at me that way, not in all the years we have been engaged. Whatever this marriage was meant to accomplish, it was never going to give either of us what we actually needed." The quiet honesty in her voice, so different from the sharp, calculated cruelty she had shown at the lake days earlier, revealed a side of Isabel that Alexander had rarely glimpsed during their entire engagement. A woman caught between her family's desperate expectations and a growing awareness that the path she had chosen was leading toward nothing but continued unhappiness for everyone involved. "What do you intend to do now?" Alexander asked carefully. Isabel straightened slightly, some of her usual composure returning even as her voice carried a new, unfamiliar note of resignation. "I intend to speak with my father about our family's finances directly, rather than continuing to hide behind arrangements built on secrets and manipulation. As for our engagement, Alexander, I think we both already know what needs to happen next. I simply needed to say the truth aloud, at least once, before it became public knowledge for everyone else to discuss." Word of the broken engagement spread through society within days, though the exact circumstances remained, for a time, a carefully guarded mystery. Clara heard the news first from her aunt, who returned from an afternoon visit with a neighbor practically breathless, with the scale of the gossip already circulating through every drawing room in the city. "They say the engagement has ended," Lydia announced, removing her gloves with hands that trembled slightly from excitement. "No one seems to know exactly why, though there are at least 4 different explanations circulating depending on who you ask." Clara set down the book she had been pretending to read for the better part of an hour, her heart quickening despite her attempts to remain composed. "What are people saying?" "Some claim Isabel broke it off herself, dissatisfied with the Duke's continued affection for another woman," Lydia said, settling into a chair with the eager energy of someone thoroughly enjoying the drama despite her niece's direct involvement in it. "Others claim the Duke ended things after discovering some scandal involving the Grant family's finances, and a few, rather unkindly, are suggesting that you had something to do with the entire affair." "Wonderful," Clara murmured, though a small, unexpected flicker of hope had begun to stir beneath her outward composure. She had not seen Alexander since the night in his father's study, though she had thought of little else in the days since. She understood his reasoning for approaching the situation carefully, for speaking privately with Isabel and her mother before allowing any public revelation to unfold. But the waiting had proven far more difficult than she had anticipated, each day bringing fresh uncertainty about exactly what direction events might take.
That uncertainty ended 2 days later, when Alexander himself arrived at her aunt's townhouse, dressed formally and carrying an expression that suggested he had finally reached some important decision.
"I have ended my engagement to Isabel," he said, once Lydia had discreetly excused herself to allow them privacy in the small sitting room. "Formally and publicly, as of this morning. Her family has been informed, and a notice will appear in tomorrow's papers, confirming the arrangement has been dissolved by mutual agreement." Clara studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of regret or hesitation, but found only quiet resolve. "How did Isabel take the news?" "Better than I expected, honestly," Alexander admitted, settling into the chair across from her. "She confessed to me that she had known about her mother's role in separating us for the past 2 years, though she claimed, and I believe her, that she had no knowledge of it when our engagement was first arranged. I think, in some strange way, she was almost relieved to finally have the truth acknowledged openly, rather than continuing to carry the weight of that secret silently." "And her mother?" Alexander's expression darkened slightly. "Mrs. Grant attempted to convince me that revealing the truth publicly would damage both our families equally, and urged me to consider quiet discretion instead. I informed her that I have no intention of protecting reputations built upon deliberate cruelty, regardless of whose reputation happens to be at stake, including my own father's memory." Clara felt a complicated wave of emotions wash over her. relief mixed with lingering apprehension about what exposing the truth so completely might ultimately cost everyone involved, including Alexander himself. What happens now? Surely there will be significant consequences for revealing something so damaging about the Grant family, and about your own father. There will be consequences, Alexander agreed. Society rarely forgives easily, and I expect both our families will face uncomfortable scrutiny for some time. But I would rather face honest consequences than continue living according to a lie constructed entirely by people who never once considered what either of us actually wanted. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, carefully wrapped bundle, setting it gently on the table between them. I brought something for you, he said. Your letters, all of them. I thought you should have them back, after everything they have cost you. Clara reached out slowly, untying the ribbon with careful fingers, and revealing the stack of letters she had written 5 years earlier. Letters full of hope and youthful devotion that had never reached the man they were intended for. Holding them now, after everything that had happened, felt like closing a wound that had remained open for far too long. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion she could no longer fully contain. You have no idea what this means to me, having proof that I was not simply forgotten, that what we had was real, even if circumstances conspired to keep us apart. I think I have some idea, Alexander said gently. I have spent 5 years believing something similarly false about you, after all. They sat together in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had uncovered together settling gradually into something resembling peace, rather than continued turmoil. But Clara knew, even as she savored this rare moment of quiet resolution, that significant challenges still lay ahead for both of them. Your mother, she said finally. The Duchess. How has she responded to all of this? Alexander's expression grew more complicated. She was, understandably, shocked to learn the full extent of my father's actions. She has always maintained a somewhat idealized view of him, despite his often difficult temperament during his lifetime. Learning that he was capable of such deliberate manipulation, particularly regarding matters of the heart, has been difficult for her to accept. Does she blame me for any of this? Clara asked carefully. No, Alexander said firmly. If anything, she has expressed considerable sympathy for what you endured, entirely without your knowledge or consent. Though I will admit, she remains cautious about the prospect of any renewed relationship between us, given the public scrutiny it would inevitably invite, particularly so soon after the collapse of my engagement to Isabel. Clara understood the concern immediately. However genuine their reconciliation felt to both of them privately, society would inevitably interpret any renewed relationship as scandalous, especially given the timing. A duke abandoning his engagement only to immediately pursue another woman, one already connected to the scandal through the garden party incident, would provide ample material for months of continued gossip and speculation. Perhaps we should proceed carefully, Clara suggested, though the words felt strange coming from her, given how desperately she wanted nothing more than to simply be near him, without the constant weight of social calculation hanging over every decision. Allow the immediate scandal surrounding your broken engagement to settle, before drawing further attention to whatever exists between us. Alexander considered her suggestion for a long moment, before nodding slowly. You are, as always, more sensible than I am about such matters. Though I confess, the prospect of waiting even a few more weeks to formally acknowledge what exists between us feels considerably more difficult than it did 5 years ago, now that I finally understand the truth of everything that kept us apart. A few weeks is considerably shorter than 5 years, Clara pointed out with a small, genuine smile, the first she had allowed herself since this entire complicated situation had begun unfolding at the garden party. Over the following weeks, exactly as Clara had predicted, society buzzed with continued speculation regarding the collapse of the Whitmore-Grant engagement. The full truth regarding Mrs. Grant's involvement in intercepting correspondence years earlier eventually became known, though the exact details remained somewhat obscured by the careful, measured way both Alexander and Bellamy chose to handle the disclosure, avoiding unnecessary cruelty toward Isabel herself, who had, after all, been an unknowing participant in her mother's original scheme. Isabel, to her credit, weathered the scandal with a composure that surprised many, who had known her primarily through her sharper, more cutting public persona. She retreated from society for a period, focusing instead on helping her father address the family's genuine financial difficulties, through more honest means than her mother had originally attempted. Clara heard, through occasional updates from Bellamy, that Isabel had eventually taken a position managing accounts for a charitable organization, a role that seemed to suit her considerable organizational talents far better than the social maneuvering she had previously been forced into by her family's circumstances. Mrs. Grant faced the harshest judgment from society, her reputation suffering considerably once the full extent of her role in the original deception became known among the city's more prominent families. She retreated largely from public life, though Alexander, despite everything, chose not to pursue any further legal consequences against her, deciding that the public exposure of her actions represented sufficient consequence without further complicating an already difficult situation for the entire Grant family. As for the Duchess, Alexander's mother gradually came to terms with the truth about her late husband's actions, eventually extending a cautious, if somewhat reserved, welcome toward the renewed connection between her son and Clara Bennett. It was not an immediate or effortless acceptance, but rather one built slowly, through repeated demonstrations of Clara's genuine character and quiet dignity, qualities the Duchess found herself increasingly unable to ignore or dismiss, regardless of her son's fiancée's family history. 6 weeks after the garden party that had begun everything, Clara received an invitation to a much smaller, more private gathering at the Whitmore estate, hosted quietly by the Duchess herself. Standing once again in that same garden, though this time surrounded by only a handful of trusted family friends, rather than the entire fashionable society that had witnessed her humiliation weeks earlier, Clara felt a profound sense of things finally coming full circle. Alexander found her near the same lake where everything had begun, though this time, instead of cold water and cruel laughter, there was only quiet evening light reflecting softly across the calm surface. "It seems appropriate," he said, coming to stand beside her, "that we should return here, now that everything has finally been resolved. I never imagined, standing soaked and humiliated in that water weeks ago, that it would lead to any of this," Clara admitted, watching the gentle ripples spreading across the lake's surface. "Neither did I," Alexander said quietly. "Though I have come to believe, looking back on everything that happened, that sometimes the most painful moments end up revealing exactly what needed to be seen all along." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, carefully wrapped box, extending it toward her with hands that trembled slightly, despite his usual composed demeanor. "I know we agreed to proceed carefully," he said, "and we have, these past 6 weeks, allowing society time to settle, allowing my mother time to adjust, allowing both of us time to be certain of exactly what we want moving forward. But I find myself no longer capable of waiting any longer to ask you properly, Clara, what I should have been permitted to ask 5 years ago, before everything was so cruelly taken from us." Clara's breath caught as she watched him lower himself carefully onto one knee, beside the same lake where her humiliation had first begun this entire extraordinary chain of events. The garden around them seemed to grow impossibly quiet as Alexander opened the small box, revealing a delicate ring inside, one that Clara recognized immediately, with a sharp intake of breath. "This belonged to my grandmother," Alexander said softly, his voice steady despite the obvious weight of the moment. "She gave it to me years ago, before she passed, telling me to save it for someone who understood the difference between loving a title and loving a person. I have carried it with me since then, waiting, though I did not fully understand at the time exactly what I was waiting for." Clara stared at the ring, her eyes filling with tears she no longer bothered trying to hold back. "Alexander, I am not asking because society expects it, or because it would resolve any remaining scandal more neatly," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "I am asking because I have spent 5 years living a life that felt hollow in ways I could never quite explain, and these past 6 weeks with you, however carefully we have proceeded, have reminded me exactly what that missing piece felt like. Clara Bennett, will you marry me?" For a long moment, Clara could not find her voice at all, overwhelmed by the culmination of everything that had happened since that terrible, humiliating moment in the lake weeks earlier. She thought of the years of grief she had carried, believing herself abandoned. She thought of the courage it had taken to walk out of that water with her head held high, refusing to let cruelty define her. And she thought of everything that had unfolded since, the painful revelations, the careful unraveling of lies, the slow, deliberate rebuilding of trust between two people who had never truly stopped loving each other, despite everything working to keep them apart. Yes, she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Alexander, I will marry you. He rose immediately, gathering her into an embrace that felt like the culmination of 5 long years of waiting, of grief, of quiet hope she had never quite managed to fully extinguish, despite every reason to abandon it. When he finally pulled back enough to slip the ring onto her finger, his hands were shaking with an emotion he no longer bothered trying to hide. News of their engagement, when it finally became public knowledge, spread through society, with considerably less scandal than either of them had anticipated. Enough time had passed since the collapse of his engagement to Isabel, and enough of the full truth had gradually become known, that most of society had already shifted their sympathy firmly toward Clara, viewing her not as a scandalous homewrecker, but as a woman who had finally received long overdue justice after years of undeserved suffering. The wedding itself, held several months later, was a considerably grander affair than either Clara or Alexander had initially anticipated, though both agreed that a public celebration served an important purpose beyond simple personal joy. It represented, in its own quiet way, a final and complete rejection of the secrecy and manipulation that had defined so much of their earlier history together. Isabel, somewhat to everyone's surprise, accepted an invitation to attend, arriving with quiet dignity and offering genuine congratulations to both Clara and Alexander before the ceremony began. The two women, who had once stood on opposite sides of such painful circumstances, found themselves engaged in a brief, surprisingly warm conversation near the edge of the very same garden where their conflict had first begun. "I owe you an apology," Isabel said quietly, her eyes carrying none of the cold satisfaction Clara remembered from that terrible afternoon months earlier. "What I did to you at that garden party was unforgivable, regardless of whatever justification I told myself at the time. I hope you can understand, even if you cannot fully forgive it, that I was carrying burdens of my own that I handled very badly." Clara studied Isabel's face carefully, searching for any remaining trace of the cruelty she had witnessed that day, but found only genuine, weary honesty. "I think," she said finally, "that we were both caught in circumstances neither of us fully created or controlled. I do not excuse what happened, but I understand, perhaps better than most, how desperation can push people toward choices they might not otherwise make." "You are far more gracious than I deserve," Isabel said quietly. "Perhaps," Clara acknowledged with a small smile, "though I find I would rather move forward with grace than continue carrying anger that serves no purpose beyond making everyone involved more miserable than necessary." The two women parted on considerably better terms than either could have imagined possible months earlier, and Clara later learned that Isabel had gone on to find genuine satisfaction in her charitable work, eventually forming her own quiet, independent life, free from the desperate financial pressures that had originally driven her toward an engagement built on secrets rather than affection. The Duchess, watching her son marry the woman he had loved for years despite every obstacle placed deliberately in their path, found herself surprised by how completely her earlier reservations had dissolved by the time the wedding day finally arrived. Standing beside Clara during a quiet moment before the ceremony began, she took her soon-to-be daughter-in-law's hands with unexpected warmth. "I confess, I did not make this easy for you these past several months," the Duchess said. "Learning the truth about my husband's actions was difficult, and I allowed that difficulty to make me more cautious toward you than you deserved." "You had every reason to be cautious," Clara said gently. "Trust is not something that should be given carelessly, particularly given everything your family has endured." "Perhaps," the Duchess said, "but watching you these past months, watching the quiet dignity with which you have handled every difficult circumstance thrown at you, I find myself deeply grateful that my son finally found his way back to you, regardless of how painfully long that journey took." As the ceremony began, Clara found herself standing once again in the Whitmore family garden, though this time, surrounded not by mocking laughter and cold water, but by genuine warmth and celebration from friends and family, who had come to witness the joining of two people whose love had survived deliberate cruelty, years of separation, and the careful unraveling of lies constructed specifically to keep them apart. Aunt Lydia, seated in the front row of guests, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief throughout the entire ceremony, occasionally leaning toward the elderly woman beside her to whisper commentary about how proud Clara's late parents would have been to witness this particular outcome. given everything their daughter had endured in the years since their own family's fortunes had collapsed so painfully. Mr. Bellamy, standing quietly near the back of the assembled guests, watched the proceedings with the satisfied expression of a man who understood better than most exactly how significant this moment truly was, having played his own quiet but crucial role in bringing the entire truth to light when he could easily have chosen silence instead. When Alexander and Clara finally exchanged their vows beside the same lake where her humiliation had first begun this extraordinary chain of events, the symbolism was not lost on anyone gathered to witness it. The water that had once represented cruelty and public shame now reflected only warm afternoon sunlight and the genuine joy of two people, finally allowed to build the life together that had been so deliberately stolen from them 5 years earlier. As they exchanged their first kiss as husband and wife, applause rippled through the assembled guests, and Clara felt, for the first time in 5 long years, that the painful chapter of her life, defined by loss, deception, and quiet grief, had finally, completely closed, replaced by something far brighter and infinitely more hopeful than she had ever dared to imagine possible during those difficult years of separation. But even as the celebration continued around them, both Clara and Alexander understood that their story was not simply about a single triumphant wedding day. It was about everything that had led them there. The painful lessons learned about trust, about the dangerous consequences of family pride placed above genuine human connection, and about the quiet, unshakable strength that had allowed Clara to rise from that lake months earlier, with her dignity intact, refusing to let cruelty define who she truly was. That strength, more than anything else, had ultimately proven to be the foundation upon which everything else had been rebuilt. A year passed quickly following the wedding, filled with the quiet, steady rhythms of a life Clara had once believed impossible for herself. She settled into her new role within the Whitmore household with the same careful, thoughtful grace that had defined her throughout everything that had happened before. Rather than simply adopting the traditional, largely ceremonial responsibilities expected of a duchess, Clara chose to involve herself directly in causes that mattered deeply to her, particularly supporting families who had experienced sudden financial hardship, similar to what her own family had endured years earlier. Working closely with Mr. Bellamy, who had become something of a trusted family friend, following his crucial role in uncovering the truth about the old Duke's deception, Clara established a modest but meaningful fund designed to help families navigate difficult financial transitions without losing their social standing entirely, the very fate that had contributed to her own family's vulnerability years earlier. Alexander, for his part, threw himself into managing the Whitmore estate with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to build a legacy defined by honesty and genuine care for those under his responsibility, rather than the calculated manipulation that had characterized his father's approach to preserving the family's standing. He often remarked, during quiet evenings spent together reviewing estate matters, that he hoped their eventual children would grow up understanding that true strength came from integrity, not from the willingness to sacrifice others for personal advantage. The Duchess, once cautious and reserved toward her new daughter-in-law, had grown genuinely fond of Clara over the months following the wedding, the two women developing an easy, comfortable relationship built on mutual respect rather than simple family obligation. She often joined Clara during her charitable work, finding unexpected fulfillment in the practical, hands-on assistance they provided together to families facing circumstances she had once viewed only from a comfortable, sheltered distance. Isabel, true to the quiet dignity she had shown at the wedding, continued building her independent life away from the pressures that had once defined her entire existence. She eventually became engaged herself, to a modest but genuinely kind gentleman she had met through her charitable work, a match built on authentic affection rather than desperate financial necessity. Clara received an invitation to Isabel's own wedding the following spring and found herself genuinely pleased to accept, understanding better than most how meaningful it was to finally build a life free from the manipulations of others. Mrs. Grant, whose reputation had suffered the most severe and lasting damage from the revelation of her role in the original deception, eventually retreated entirely from the social circles she had once navigated with such calculated precision. Though Alexander had chosen not to pursue further consequences against her, society itself had proven far less forgiving, and she spent her remaining years living quietly, largely removed from the world she had once tried so desperately to manipulate on her family's behalf. Aunt Lydia, delighted beyond measure by her niece's remarkable change in fortune, remained a constant and beloved presence in Clara's new life, often visiting the Whitmore estate to share tea and gossip with the Duchess, the two women forming an unlikely but genuine friendship that brought Clara considerable joy to witness. One evening, nearly 18 months after their wedding, Clara and Alexander found themselves once again standing beside the familiar lake at the edge of the Whitmore estate, watching the sunset paint the water in soft shades of orange and gold. "Do you ever think about that day?" Alexander asked quietly, his arm wrapped comfortably around her shoulders. "The garden party, I mean. Everything that happened here." Clara considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "I think about it often, actually. Not with the pain I once felt, but with a strange sort of gratitude, difficult as that might be to explain to anyone who was not there to witness the entire situation unfold." "Gratitude," Alexander repeated, clearly surprised by her choice of word. "For being publicly humiliated in front of half of society. For the truth finally coming to light," Clara clarified gently. "If Isabel had never pushed me into that lake, if that entire scene had never played out so publicly, I wonder sometimes whether any of the rest of it would have happened at all. Whether you would have ever reached out to me, whether Mr. Bellamy would have felt compelled to share what he had discovered, whether any of the truth would have ever emerged from beneath the lies your father and Mrs. Grant constructed so carefully all those years ago." Alexander was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of her perspective. "I suppose there is a strange kind of justice in that," he said finally, "that the very moment intended to humiliate you completely, to remind you of your supposedly diminished place in society, ended up becoming the catalyst that finally exposed everything and brought us back together." "Sometimes," Clara said softly, watching the last light of the sunset reflect gently across the calm water, "the moments that feel most devastating turn out to be exactly the moments that change everything for the better, even when we cannot possibly see it at the time." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the evening settle gently over the estate that had witnessed both the worst and the best moments of their extraordinary story. Somewhere in the house behind them, Clara could hear the faint sound of the Duchess's laughter, mingled with Aunt Lydia's familiar voice, the two women no doubt enjoying another evening of tea and lively conversation. "I love you," Alexander said simply, turning to look at her with the same quiet devotion he had shown her since those first summer walks together, so many years, and so many painful obstacles ago. "I love you too," Clara replied, leaning into him with the comfortable ease of someone who had finally, after so much hardship, found exactly where she was meant to be. As they turned to walk back toward the house together, the lake behind them settling into peaceful darkness beneath the emerging stars, neither of them needed to say aloud what they both already understood completely. The cruelty that had once tried to define Clara Bennett, the deliberate deception that had once tried to keep two people apart for the sake of wealth and social standing, had ultimately failed entirely against the quiet, unshakable strength of genuine love and hard-won truth. Clara had risen from that lake months earlier, not simply as a woman recovering from public humiliation, but as someone who had finally reclaimed the dignity and truth that had been stolen from her years before. And in doing so, she had changed not only her own future, but the futures of everyone connected to that fateful afternoon beside the Whitmore estate's quiet, unassuming lake. Everything, indeed, had changed. And for Clara and Alexander, walking together into the warm lights of the home they now shared, everything had finally changed for the better. 3 years after the wedding, the Whitmore estate looked very different from the place it had once been, under the old Duke's careful, controlling influence. The gardens, once maintained with rigid formality, designed to impress visiting dignitaries, had been gradually softened under Clara's guidance into something warmer and more welcoming, filled with flowers chosen for their beauty rather than their ability to signal wealth. The old Duke's study, once a locked, forbidding room filled with secrets, had been converted into a bright, comfortable library where Clara spent many afternoons working alongside Mr. Bellamy on the expanding charitable fund that now supported dozens of families across the county. It was in that same library, on a quiet autumn morning, that Clara received an unexpected letter bearing a seal she did not immediately recognize. Curious, she opened it carefully and found herself reading a request from a young woman named Charlotte Ainsley, whose family had recently suffered a sudden collapse in fortune following her father's failed business ventures. The letter explained, in careful, hesitant handwriting, that Charlotte had heard of Clara's own story, through whispered accounts still occasionally circulating through society, and wondered whether the Duchess might be willing to offer guidance, or perhaps even assistance, as her own family struggled to navigate a world that had suddenly turned unwelcoming and judgmental toward them. Clara read the letter twice, feeling an unexpected wave of memory wash over her. The same helpless uncertainty she herself had once felt years earlier, watching her own family's world crumble around her through no fault of her own. She showed the letter to Alexander that evening, both of them agreeing immediately that Charlotte deserved not simply financial assistance, but the kind of genuine understanding that only came from someone who had walked a similar difficult path herself. Clara invited Charlotte to visit the estate the following week, and found herself immediately drawn to the young woman's quiet resilience, so reminiscent of her own younger self before everything had changed. Over tea in the newly renovated library, Clara listened carefully as Charlotte described the whispered judgments she now faced at social gatherings, the friends who had quietly distanced themselves once her family's financial troubles became public knowledge, and the growing fear that her entire future had been irreparably damaged by circumstances entirely beyond her control. "I understand more than you might realize," Clara said gently, once Charlotte had finished sharing her difficult story. "My own family experienced something remarkably similar, many years ago. I know how isolating and frightening it can feel, watching people who once welcomed you warmly suddenly treat you as though you carry some kind of contagious misfortune. How did you manage to move forward from it?" Charlotte asked, her eyes filled with the same desperate hope Clara remembered feeling herself during her darkest moments. Clara considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "I learned, slowly and often painfully, that other people's judgment says far more about their own character than it does about mine. It took me years to fully understand that lesson, and I certainly did not always manage to live by it perfectly. But I promise you, Charlotte, that circumstances beyond your control do not define your worth, no matter how convincingly society sometimes tries to suggest otherwise." Over the following months, Clara took Charlotte under her guidance, not simply providing financial assistance through the charitable fund, but offering genuine mentorship and friendship as the young woman gradually rebuilt her confidence and found her own path forward. Charlotte eventually secured a respectable position assisting with the fund's growing administrative needs, work that suited her careful, detail-oriented nature perfectly, and the two women developed a warm friendship that reminded Clara constantly of exactly why her own difficult journey had ultimately proven so meaningful. Meanwhile, the Whitmore household welcomed its own new addition that same year, when Clara gave birth to a daughter they named Eleanor, after Clara's own mother, whose quiet dignity through hardship had first taught Clara the strength she would later need so desperately during her own difficult journey. Alexander doted on his daughter with obvious devotion, often remarking to Clara that he hoped Eleanor would grow up in a world defined by honesty and genuine kindness, rather than the calculated manipulation that had shaped so much of his own childhood under his father's controlling influence. The Duchess, thrilled beyond measure to become a grandmother, spent considerable time at the estate helping care for young Eleanor, often sharing stories with Clara about Alexander's own childhood, painting a more complete picture of the complicated, sometimes difficult relationship between father and son that had ultimately shaped so much of what happened between Clara and Alexander years earlier. "He was never cruel toward Alexander directly," the Duchess explained one afternoon, watching her granddaughter sleep peacefully in her bassinet, "but he was demanding in ways that left little room for genuine affection or personal choice. I sometimes wonder whether his actions toward you and Alexander stemmed less from genuine cruelty and more from a rigid, misguided belief that he was protecting our family's future the only way he knew how, however wrong and hurtful that approach ultimately proved to be. I have made peace with understanding his reasons, even if I cannot excuse his methods," Clara said thoughtfully. "I think that is perhaps the most any of us can do, looking back on painful history. Understanding does not require forgiveness, but it does allow us to move forward without carrying unnecessary bitterness." As Eleanor grew older, Clara made a point of regularly visiting the lake at the edge of the estate with her daughter, the same lake that had once witnessed such painful humiliation, but had since become, in Clara's own mind, a symbol of resilience and eventual triumph rather than continued shame. She would often sit at the water's edge, watching Eleanor toss small stones into the calm surface, and reflect on how completely her own life had transformed since that fateful garden party years earlier. Isabel, now happily settled into her own marriage and continuing her meaningful charitable work, remained in occasional contact with Clara over the years, the two women having built an unlikely but genuine friendship from the ashes of what had once been bitter rivalry. Isabel visited the estate periodically, bringing her own young son to play alongside Eleanor, the two children forming an easy friendship entirely unaware of the complicated history that had once connected their mothers under such difficult circumstances. "It is strange, is it not?" Isabel remarked during one such visit, watching their children play together near the garden's edge, how completely different our lives became from what either of us might have predicted, standing at this very lake all those years ago. "Strange, but ultimately for the better, I think," Clara replied, watching Eleanor giggle as she chased after Isabel's son across the soft grass. "I do not think either of us could have imagined, during that terrible afternoon, exactly how much would eventually change for both of us." Mr. Bellamy, who had continued serving as a trusted advisor to both the charitable fund and the broader Whitmore estate, eventually retired from his formal legal practice, though he remained a beloved family friend, often visiting to share dinner and reminisce about the complicated events that had first brought Clara and Alexander back together years earlier. "I have handled a great many delicate matters throughout my career," he remarked during one such visit, watching young Eleanor demonstrate her newly learned skill of building small towers from wooden blocks. "But I confess, none of them ever proved quite so satisfying in their eventual resolution as the matter I brought to your attention that morning, all those years ago." "We owe you a debt we can never fully repay," Alexander said sincerely, raising his glass toward the man who had risked considerable professional consequence to reveal a truth that could easily have remained buried indefinitely. "Watching the two of you build this life together, and the good work you continue doing for families facing hardship, similar to what you once experienced yourself," Bellamy replied, "that is more than sufficient repayment for an old solicitor who simply chose to do what he believed was right." As the years continued to unfold, the Whitmore estate became known throughout the county not simply for its wealth and social standing, but for the genuine warmth and generosity of the family who called it home. Clara's charitable work expanded steadily, eventually helping dozens of families navigate difficult financial transitions with dignity and genuine support, rather than the isolating judgment society so often inflicted upon those experiencing sudden hardship. Alexander, for his part, became known among his peers as a landlord and estate holder of unusual fairness and consideration, often citing his own painful experience with his father's controlling manipulation as the reason he refused to treat those under his responsibility with anything less than genuine respect and honesty. Looking back on everything that had happened, from that terrible, humiliating afternoon beside the lake to the rich, meaningful life she now shared with Alexander and their growing family, Clara often found herself marveling at the strange, unpredictable way that even the most painful moments could ultimately lead toward something far more beautiful than she could have ever imagined possible during her darkest hours. The water that had once closed over her head in cruel humiliation had, in the years since, become nothing more than a peaceful backdrop to countless happy family gatherings, a quiet reminder that dignity, once claimed and held firmly despite every attempt to strip it away, could ultimately prove far more powerful than any cruelty designed to destroy it. And whenever Clara found herself standing at the edge of that familiar lake, watching her daughter play happily in the golden afternoon light, she understood completely that everything truly had changed, not simply for herself, but for everyone whose lives had been touched by the painful truths finally brought into the light on that unforgettable day so many years before.